This Bible study is intended to be a help for all those who have perhaps lost a baby and are wondering whether or not that child is with the Lord. Or maybe you know of somebody who is in that situation and you are in a situation of trying to give them some encouragement and some biblical counsel. So this Bible study really is all about the question, does a child who dies, a baby that dies before the age of accountability, do they go to heaven? And so let me share with you 5 different passages of Scripture that I think bear on that particular question. The first one is Matthew chapter 18 and verse 6. And this is where Jesus is expressing his love generally for little children. If you remember, Jesus calls a little child unto him and puts him on his lap and then says, except you be converted and become like little children, you shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. So we see that Jesus is using a little child as an illustration of childlike faith. Now, when you come down to verse 6 of Matthew 18, Jesus makes this statement, whoso shall offend one of these little ones which believe in me. Underline that phrase, which believe in me. It appears that Jesus is actually saying that children have a very innocent, childlike faith. And so God, I believe, makes special provision for little children. Obviously, a little child is not old enough to have real adult faith because they don't understand the gospel and therefore can't make an intellectual decision regarding the gospel. But I find it very interesting that Jesus, in speaking about these innocent children that he is using as an illustration, uses the phrase, if you offend one of these little ones which believe in me, it would be better that a millstone were hanged around your neck and you were drowned in the depth of the sea. So Christ obviously has a special place in his heart for little children and seems to allude to the fact that they have an innocence which has merit when it comes to their going to heaven. And then right across the page, the second passage is Matthew 19 and verse 14, where it says Jesus here is rebuking his disciples because they were trying to send the kids away. They were actually annoyed with all the little kids that were flocking around Jesus. And Jesus rebukes the disciples, and he says in 19:14, suffer or allow little children, and forbid them not to come unto me, for of such is the kingdom of heaven. Now that's an interesting statement. Jesus is actually saying heaven is populated with these little kids that you're trying to send away from me. That would only make sense if it were true that children who die before the age of accountability are in the Lord's presence. That's the only way that verse makes any sense, at least to me. The third passage, and I think for me probably the most powerful one, is 2 Samuel chapter 12, and it's King David right after he lost his infant newborn son. And if you remember the context, that particular death of that child was a specific judgment of God because of David's sin there with Bathsheba. And so David is grieving over that and makes a pretty astounding statement. And I'm reading 2 Samuel 12:23. Well, let me back up to verse 22. David said, while the child was yet alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, who can tell whether God will be gracious unto me that the child might live? But now he is dead, wherefore should I fast? Can I bring him back again? And then here's this statement, underline this statement, I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me. In other words, David's saying, I can't get this child back, but I am going to go see him again someday. I will go to him. Now, the only possible interpretation of that verse is in the context of infant salvation. That children, again, who die before the age of accountability are safe in the Lord's presence. The other two passages are very similar, and both have to do with the fact that God does not judge little innocent children because of the adult's sin. God doesn't hold the little kids accountable. The first one is in Numbers chapter 14 in verse 31. This is when Israel was in the wilderness at a place called Kadesh Barnea. And remember, they sent spies in to spy out the promised land, and the spies came back, and 10 out of 12 gave a very pessimistic, negative report. And God then pronounces judgment on the adult generation. And God basically says this in Numbers 14:31. But your little ones, which you said would be a prey, them will I bring in, and they shall know the land which you have despised. But as for you, your carcasses will fall in this wilderness. So the judgment was for the adults, all of those over age 20, because they're the ones that sinned and disobeyed God, but God did not hold the little kids responsible. Those are the ones who actually later on enjoyed the blessing of going into the promised land. And then finally, the last one is the last verse of the book of Jonah, which I just preached on recently, where God is talking about his reason for sparing that wicked city of Nineveh, if you remember that passage in Jonah chapter 4. And God's rationale there is very interesting. And it wasn't certainly because of the sin of the adults, because they were wicked and vile sinners. So why was it that God, in his grace, spared Nineveh? Well, if you look at Jonah 4:11, God himself gives the answer. And he's speaking to Jonah, and he says, should I not spare Nineveh, that great city, wherein are more than 60,000 persons that cannot discern between their right hand and their left hand? And that's how the book of Jonah ends. So what's God saying? These little kids in the city, 120,000 little kids that are so small, they haven't even learned which hand is their right hand yet. I'm not going to kill them and judge them because of the sins of the adults. And to me, that also is really a powerful insight into the nature of God's heart and the special place in God's heart for little ones. Well, I hope this Bible study has been helpful to you, maybe answered some questions, given you some encouragement. And if you can use this to encourage others, I would encourage you to do so. Thank you very much for listening.